something strange happens to empaths who actually wake up. They don't become softer. They don't become more accepting, more forgiving, more willing to meet people halfway. They become the opposite. They develop a ruthless intolerance for things they used to swallow without question. Things most people consider completely normal. And this shift terrifies everyone around them, because the empath who used to absorb everything, forgive everything, tolerate everything, suddenly has a line. And that line is absolute. Carl Jung spent decades studying patients who went through this exact transformation. What he found shattered the popular image of the compassionate, endlessly giving empath. Jung discovered that when empaths genuinely awaken, when they integrate their shadow, reclaim their boundaries, and stop confusing self-sacrifice with love, they don't just change. They become psychologically untouchable, not cold, not heartless, but impossible to manipulate, impossible to guilt, impossible to pull back into the patterns that nearly destroyed them. And the thing that shocked Jung most was how specific this intolerance became. It wasn't a general hardening. Awakened empaths developed precise, non-negotiable refusals around very particular dynamics. Dynamics that most people accept as just part of life. Dynamics that the empath themselves used to participate in, willingly, even eagerly. But once they woke up, these dynamics became physically unbearable, not just uncomfortable, repulsive on a nervous system level. Today I'm going to show you the 7 specific things awakened empaths will never tolerate again, why each one becomes impossible for them to accept after genuine transformation, and what it means if you're already feeling this shift happening inside you. Because if you've been noticing that things you used to endure now make your skin crawl, Jung would tell you that's not you becoming difficult. That's you finally becoming whole. The first thing awakened empaths will never tolerate is emotional dishonesty. Not lying in the obvious sense. Emotional dishonesty is subtler than that. It's the friend who says, "I'm fine," while radiating resentment. The partner who insists nothing's wrong while punishing you with silence. The family member who performs warmth at gatherings while harboring contempt they'll never admit. It's the gap between what someone says they feel and what they actually feel. And for an awakened empath, that gap becomes unbearable. Jung called this the persona, the mask people wear to navigate social reality. Everyone wears one to some degree, but Jung observed that awakened empaths develop an almost allergic reaction to people who live inside their masks permanently, who perform emotions they don't feel, who say words that contradict the energy behind them. Because the empath can feel both layers simultaneously, what's being said and what's actually true, and the dissonance between them creates a kind of psychic friction that's genuinely painful. Before awakening, empaths managed this dissonance constantly. They'd sense someone's anger underneath a smile and work to smooth it over. They'd feel the lie and pretend they didn't. They'd detect the performance and participate in it to keep the peace. But after genuine transformation, they lose the ability to pretend, not the willingness, the ability. Their nervous system simply refuses to override what it perceives, so they stop participating in emotional dishonesty. And that refusal looks like rejection to people who've relied on the empath playing along. Jung noted that this was the first thing to shift, because emotional dishonesty was the water awakened empaths had been swimming in their entire lives. Once they saw it clearly, they couldn't unsee it, and they couldn't pretend the water wasn't poisoned. The second thing awakened empaths will never tolerate is one-sided emotional labor. This is the dynamic where one person in a relationship does all the feeling, all the processing, all the holding. where the empath is expected to manage not just their own emotional world, but everyone else's, where they're the one who notices tension and addresses it, who senses hurt and initiates repair, who carries the emotional weight of every relationship they're in, while the other person coasts on the empath's labor. Jung observed that unhealed empaths were almost always trapped in these arrangements. They'd become the emotional manager of their families, friendships, workplaces. They'd monitor everyone's states, anticipate needs, smooth conflicts, absorb discomfort, all while no one did the same for them. And the empath accepted this because they'd been trained from childhood to believe that their value came from emotional service, that they existed to hold what others couldn't hold. But Jung found that awakened empaths had a revelation that destroyed this pattern permanently. They realized that one-sided emotional labor wasn't love. It was exploitation wearing the mask of intimacy. The people in their lives hadn't chosen them because they valued the empath. They'd chosen them because the empath provided free emotional management. And the moment the empath stopped providing it, those people either demanded it back or disappeared, which told the empath everything they needed to know about what the relationship was actually built on. After this revelation, awakened empaths develop zero tolerance for imbalanced emotional investment. They can feel within minutes whether someone is capable of reciprocal emotional engagement or whether they're looking for a caretaker. And they walk away from the second type without guilt, not because they've become selfish, because they finally understand the difference between genuine connection and being someone's unpaid emotional employee. The third thing awakened empaths will never tolerate is guilt-based manipulation. This is the weapon most commonly used against empaths, and it's devastating because it exploits the empath's core wiring. Guilt manipulation sounds like, after everything I've done for you. It sounds like, I guess I'm just not important to you. It sounds like silence that forces you to chase. It sounds like tears strategically deployed to make you abandon your own boundary. It takes the empath's natural capacity for compassion and turns it into a leash. Jung studied this dynamic extensively because he saw it destroy more empaths than almost any other pattern. The mechanism was elegant and cruel. Someone discovers that the empath responds to guilt the way most people respond to physical pain, immediately, reflexively, desperately trying to make it stop. So they learn to trigger guilt whenever the empath tries to establish boundaries, express needs, or pull away. The empath becomes conditioned. Guilt equals danger, boundary equals punishment. And they stay trapped in situations that are killing them because leaving triggers guilt that feels unsurvivable. But when an empath genuinely awakens, something fundamental changes in how their nervous system processes guilt. Jung described it as the empath finally separating authentic remorse from manufactured guilt. Authentic remorse comes from within when you've genuinely caused harm. Manufactured guilt is installed from outside by someone who benefits from your compliance. Before awakening, these felt identical. The empath couldn't distinguish between I've done something wrong and someone is making me feel wrong for having a boundary. After awakening, the distinction becomes crystal clear, and manufactured guilt stops working entirely. Jung found that this was the transformation that most destabilized the empath's existing relationships, because guilt had been the primary control mechanism in almost every dynamic. When it stopped working, the people who relied on it panicked. They'd escalate. More guilt, more pressure, more emotional punishment. And the awakened empath would watch this escalation with a strange new clarity, recognizing for the first time that the other person's distress wasn't caused by the empath's boundary. It was caused by the loss of control over the empath. And that recognition made the manipulation not just ineffective, but repulsive. And this is something worth sitting with, because if you're in the middle of this shift, if guilt that once controlled you is starting to lose its grip, that's not you becoming cold or heartless. That's your psyche, doing exactly what Jung described, learning to tell the difference between what you genuinely owe and what someone has trained you to believe you owe. That kind of inner clarity is exactly what the reflection exercises in our guide, True Self-Discovery, were designed to help you develop. 24 practices rooted in Jung's work that help you find your own center, your own knowing beneath all the noise others have put there. You'll find the link below. The fourth thing awakened empaths will never tolerate is relationships that require self-abandonment. This sounds dramatic until you realize how common it actually is. Self-abandonment is dimming your energy because your partner finds your intensity threatening. It's silencing your observations because your family doesn't want to hear uncomfortable truths. It's shrinking your needs to fit inside someone else's comfort zone. It's editing your personality, your perception, your very self to maintain a relationship that only survives if you're less than you are. Jung recognized this as one of the most insidious patterns in empaths' lives because it happens gradually. Nobody asks you to abandon yourself all at once. It's a slow erosion. You stop mentioning what you noticed. You learn not to bring up certain topics. You adjust your responses to avoid someone's reaction. You make yourself smaller in increments so slight that you don't realize you've disappeared until one day you look in the mirror and can't find yourself. Jung called this the sacrifice of individuation on the altar of belonging. The empath trades their authentic self for connection. But Jung was clear that what they're getting isn't real connection. It's a conditional arrangement where they're allowed proximity only as long as they remain the edited, diminished version of themselves that doesn't threaten anyone. Awakened empaths recognize this trade and refuse it absolutely. Not because they don't want connection, they want it desperately. But they've learned that connection purchased through self-abandonment isn't connection. It's captivity with company. The person who claims to love you but can only tolerate the reduced version of you doesn't love you. They love the version that doesn't challenge them. And an awakened empath would rather be alone with their whole self than accompanied by someone who requires them to be half. This refusal costs them relationships, sometimes many relationships, sometimes most of them. Jung acknowledged this honestly. Individuation is expensive. You will lose people who only value the performance, but what you gain is something that can't be taken from you. Your own life, lived on your own terms, in your own full expression. The fifth thing awakened empaths will never tolerate is being treated as the designated healer. Every empath knows this role. You're the one people come to when they're falling apart. The one who gets the 3 a.m. phone call. The one who holds space, processes pain, offers insight, absorbs the overflow. You're the unofficial therapist for your friend group, the emotional first responder for your family, the person everyone leans on while no one notices you're buckling. Jung observed that empaths were almost always assigned this role in childhood, the parentified child, the little therapist, the one who learned to hold everyone else's pain before they had developed the capacity to hold their own. This role felt like identity, like purpose, like meaning, like the reason they existed, and giving it up felt like dying. But Jung found something disturbing underneath this pattern. The empath's compulsive healing of others wasn't purely compassionate. It served a shadow function. As long as they were focused on everyone else's wounds, they never had to face their own. As long as they were the healer, they never had to admit they were wounded. The role of designated healer was simultaneously a gift to others and an avoidance strategy for themselves. Awakened empaths see through this completely. They recognize that their compulsive need to heal was partly genuine compassion and partly a sophisticated way to avoid their own pain. And they stop volunteering for the role, not because they've lost compassion, because they've gained honesty. They can still hold space when they choose to, but they refuse to be the default emotional processing center for everyone in their orbit. They refuse to sacrifice their own healing to manage everyone else's, and they refuse to let others use them as a substitute for doing their own psychological work. Jung emphasized that this shift was essential for the empath's survival. You cannot individuate while carrying everyone else's unconscious material. You cannot find yourself while constantly losing yourself in other people's pain. The designated healer role has to die for the actual person underneath to live. The sixth thing awakened empaths will never tolerate is passive-aggressive communication. This one might seem minor compared to the others, but Jung found it was actually one of the most psychologically corrosive dynamics for empaths. Passive aggression is hostility wearing a disguise. It's the sarcastic comment framed as a joke, the compliment laced with contempt, the withdrawal of warmth as punishment without ever stating what's wrong, the weaponized sigh, the loaded silence, the nothing that means everything. For unhealed empaths, passive aggression was maddening because they could feel the hostility underneath but couldn't prove it existed. The passive-aggressive person maintains plausible deniability. If you call it out, they say you're overreacting, you're imagining things, you're too sensitive. So, the empath is trapped between what they perceive and what they're told is real, between their own accurate reading and the other person's gaslighting. Jung understood why this particular dynamic was so destructive for empaths. It recreated the exact conditions of their childhood wounding. The child who sensed rage beneath a parent's smile but was told everything was fine. The child who perceived danger but was gaslit into believing they were wrong. Passive aggression puts the empath back in that impossible position, sensing truth while being denied the right to acknowledge it. Awakened empaths refuse this dynamic entirely because they have finally stopped doubting their perception. They feel the hostility. They name it. And if the other person denies it, the empath trusts their own reading over the denial. They don't argue, don't chase, don't try to prove what they felt. They simply make decisions based on what their nervous system accurately detected. And that usually means withdrawing from people who can't communicate directly. Jung noted that this intolerance for indirect communication was actually a sign of profound psychological health. The empath had finally stopped prioritizing other people's comfort over their own accurate perception. They'd stopped abandoning their own knowing to maintain someone else's pretense. And that refusal, the refusal to doubt yourself when your reading is clear, is one of the most powerful things a healed empath can possess. The seventh thing awakened empaths will never tolerate is environments that punish authenticity. This is the big one, the one that often requires the most dramatic changes in an empath's life. Because environments that punish authenticity aren't rare, they're everywhere. Families where honesty creates conflict. Workplaces where speaking truth gets you marginalized. Friend groups where being real makes people uncomfortable. Social circles where the unspoken rule is perform or be excluded. Jung called these systems of enforced persona. Everyone agrees to wear their masks, and anyone who takes their mask off threatens the entire system. Because if one person is real, It highlights that everyone else is performing, and the system can't tolerate that exposure, so it punishes the authentic person, labels them difficult, dramatic, too much. Not a team player, the problem. Before awakening, empaths survived in these environments by wearing the thickest masks of all. They performed agreeableness, performed calm, performed accommodation. They made themselves the easiest person in the room so that no one would direct the system's punishment toward them. And it worked. They survived. But they survived by becoming invisible, by making their authentic self so hidden that even they couldn't find it anymore. Awakened empaths can't do this. Their transformation has dismantled the persona so thoroughly that putting the mask back on feels like suffocation. They've tasted what it's like to be real, to speak from their actual experience, to express their genuine perception, to exist as themselves rather than as a performance designed to manage everyone else's comfort. And going back to the mask is impossible, not hard, impossible. Their psychology has reorganized around authenticity, and performing inauthenticity now causes them a kind of psychic pain that's worse than any punishment the system could deliver. So they leave. They leave families that require performance. They leave jobs that punish honesty. They leave friendships that only function if everyone stays in character. And these departures look dramatic and unnecessary to people still inside the system. But to the awakened empath, staying is the dramatic choice. Staying is the unnecessary sacrifice. Leaving is simply what happens when you can no longer pretend to be someone you're not, in order to belong somewhere that never wanted the real you in the first place. Jung found this was often the final intolerance to develop, and the most transformative, because once an empath refuses to exist in environments that punish authenticity, they're forced to build a life that actually fits who they are. And that life looks nothing like what they had before. It's smaller, quieter, less populated, but every relationship in it is real. Every interaction is honest. Every connection is built on actual knowing rather than mutual performance. Here's what Jung ultimately observed about these 7 intolerances. They weren't separate developments. They were expressions of a single, fundamental shift. The empath had finally started valuing themselves as much as they had always valued everyone else. That's it. That's the entire transformation. They stopped being willing to sacrifice their peace, their perception, their authenticity, and their energy for people and systems that never reciprocated. And this shift looked different from the outside than it felt from the inside. From the outside, it looked like the empath had become rigid, judgmental, difficult, cold. From the inside, it felt like finally being able to breathe, like putting down a weight they'd been carrying so long they'd forgotten it wasn't part of their body. Like coming home to themselves after a lifetime of living in other people's houses. Jung emphasized that this transformation wasn't about becoming less loving. It was about redirecting love. The empath had spent their entire life directing enormous love outward, toward people who didn't reciprocate, toward systems that exploited them, toward dynamics that drained them. Awakening didn't destroy that love. It turned it inward for the first time. And an empath who finally loves themselves with the same ferocity they have always loved others becomes something the world has never seen from them before. Not a doormat, not a healer on demand, not an emotional service provider, a whole person, boundaried and compassionate, open and discerning, powerful and gentle, everything they always were, but finally for themselves too. If you're experiencing these intolerances right now, if things you used to endure are becoming impossible to accept, if relationships that once felt normal now feel suffocating, Jung would tell you this isn't breakdown, it's breakthrough. Your psychology is reorganizing around a simple truth you've been avoiding your entire life. You deserve the same care, honesty, and respect that you've always given everyone else. And any person, system, or dynamic that can't meet that standard no longer gets access to you. That's not cruelty. That's not ego. That's not the empath becoming something they're not. That's the empath finally becoming who they always were, underneath all the accommodation, all the performance, all the self-sacrifice that was never actually about love. It was about fear. Fear that if you stopped giving everything, you'd be left with nothing. But Jung discovered the opposite was true. When you stop giving everything away, you finally have something left, yourself. And that self, whole, boundaried, awake, is worth more than every relationship you'll lose by refusing to abandon it. These 7 intolerances aren't weaknesses. They're the immune system of a healed psyche. They exist to protect something precious, the authentic self that nearly died under the weight of everyone else's needs. And if that immune system is activating in you right now, let it work. Let it refuse what needs to be refused. Let it protect what needs to be protected. You've spent your whole life keeping everyone else safe. It's time your psychology returned the favor. If you're in the middle of this shift, if you're watching old tolerances dissolve and wondering who you're becoming, our guide True Self-Discovery might meet you exactly where you are. 24 reflection exercises drawn from Jung's teachings, built to help you find your own way within, especially when everything outside is rearranging. Click below to get True Self-Discovery.